Pop art, the mid-20th century visual movement, shares a name with pop music, and Peter Blake has a significant place in the history of both. His record sleeves, including most famously the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, brought to a wider audience the techniques that he and other pop artists had developed. Collages, still lifes, self-portraits, that used contemporary materials such as lapel badges, newspaper and magazine cuttings, and advertising wrappings. Blake's work, in pictures, album covers and book jackets, is often inspired by his lifelong passion for collecting objects, many of which featured in the show he curated at the Museum of Everything in London.
We're sitting in this Rain-Mash gallery and looking around this exhibition, your own collections and collections of other people. A gallery goer might now say, oh, there's a Peter Blake over there, or even that work looks as if it was influenced by Peter Blake, because you seem to us to have a very recognisable style. Do you have a sense of what the Peter Blake style is?
I do, yes, absolutely. And I must say, in recent years, I've kind of taken advantage of it, if you will. I mean, there is a kind of Peter Blake incorporated almost aspect to the work at the moment. I take those motifs like a heart and a star and the rainbow and a target, and almost kind of claim them as my invention, which of course they're not. But I think they've become recognisable as my work. And I suppose there's other ways of painting, and there are a lot of clues really to pick up on it.
And some artists and writers, particularly later in their careers, they have spoken of feeling trapped by their style and trying to get outside it or to do something different. Have you ever felt that frustration?
Never. I mean, I've always been so diverse from the very beginning. I think if I'd been, a lot of artists change towards the end of their lives, don't they? Abstract expressionists become realists, and realists become abstract expressionists. In a way, I've always encompassed a lot of things anyway. I mean, at the moment, I'm painting, collaging, making some jewellery. So if I ever became bored with one aspect, I move across to another.
The tag pop art is almost inevitably applied. If we put your name into an internet search engine,
Godfather of.
Godfather of, you are. Does that label ever feel irritating or limiting to you?
Not really, because again, it was a tiny section of what I've done. I think my take on the phrase pop art, I tell a story that we were having, a group of us were having dinner in the very early 60s, Richard Smith, Robin Denny, a group of painters with Lawrence Alloway. And he was very much a mentor of the younger artists then. He was a critic, very involved with the ICA. And we were talking about what I was doing, and I explained that I was trying to make an art that was a parallel to pop music, so that you would read it in the same way. And he said, what, a kind of pop art? And I maintained that's how the phrase came about. But I've been associated with it from the beginning, and I think that the problems came up when, for instance, in America, it was never recognised really that there was any pop art in this country until Marco Livingston put on the show at the RA, and he reassessed the whole situation and suddenly put it all into perspective of what happened when, and I think at that point I began to get some kind of credit.
It's sometimes, in the way that Impressionism was originally an insult, it's sometimes been used in a disparaging way of artists, that people use it to suggest that it's not serious art or high art.
They do, and perhaps it isn't. I mean, certainly it's always been a problem I've had to deal with, that I think among my fellow painters, I think often I'm not, I mean, if you think of Frank Auerbach and me, you would think of me as a lighter artist than Frank, and which is I love his paintings and he's a friend, but you would say he was a more serious artist than me, and I kind of accept that. I mean, I've been very diverse. I haven't chosen really to take that path of very high art. it's always had a vulgarity, and it's always been populist. So I accept that.
Blake is 29. Of the four, he's much the most established. His cheerful, uncompromising comments on the modern world have been exhibited at the Royal Academy, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and so on, and he sold pictures to all sorts of organizations in America as well as in this country.
Pop art was seen as being something very modern, immediate and young, in that same way that there's a generation now who will call young British artists and are getting older, so it becomes difficult. Did that become a burden that you were associated particularly with that young movement?
No, I think not, because of this diversity. I mean, I've never relied on it for a living, and I've never it's never been my one aim, so it wasn't a problem. It still isn't.
A couple of your earliest serious works, Children Reading Comics, which is from 1954, and ABC Minors, 1955, they seem to a viewer, they open up your childhood to us, or aspects of it. And what seems crucial to people who look at your work is that you were drenched in popular culture, in entertainment from very early on.
Yeah, probably. I was 7 when the Second World War started, so I was really a child of the war. I was evacuated, and until I was 14, that was childhood. Suddenly the war ended. I came back to Dartford. I got a place at Gravesend School of Art. So adulthood started instantly when childhood stopped, in a curious way. So at 14 I was at art school. The first year at the Royal College of Art in 1953, it was compulsory that you were in the life room the whole time. I mean, there would have been 10 life models at any time with crowds all around them. And then you were released from that, and suddenly you were on your own. And it was at that point that those pictures started. So in a way, childhood was only 5 years ago. So I think I in that moment when you choose where you'll go, I think I kind of chose to be, perhaps at that point, to be autobiographical. So the picture of the two little boys is my brother and my cousin, and they're wearing their ABC Minors badges. So in a way I was still painting about a childhood which it was barely over, and it went on from there. And I think I've never lost, I'm still a child in a curious way.
But I want to go into the autobiography of those paintings, because they tell us that from very early on, comics in one case and cinema in the others, you had a great exposure to those things.
My mum used to take me to the cinema almost every day, almost probably from the age of 2. So I would have been seeing Shirley Temple films and the big Disney films as they came out. Snow White I would have seen when it came out. Then as I got a little bit older, she would take me to the cinema in the evening. So I had this background of the history of cinema. And I must have seen, there was a certain Bowery Boys film that was always the support film. I must have seen it 100 times. And then, the interest, my mum and aunt took me to the professional wrestling in 1947, so I was 15 then, and I've had a lifelong interest in that. So, and circuses and fun fairs are things I've loved from a child. So it was that strata of entertainment that I was that I started off with and have kind of stayed with.
And some of it comes out, the movies, for example, comes out very directly in the work, references to Tarzan or Wizard of Oz and those kind of films. They have stayed with you very strongly.
Very much, and they've become even stronger in recent years. There have been quite a lot of painting and things about the kind of phenomena of a girl moving into womanhood, and there are so many incidents of. The Wizard of Oz does it, Snow White does it, of children in puberty, in danger, and usually suddenly rescued. Dorothy wakes up, and I think that's an area of life that I've been intrigued with.
Your mother's fascination with cinema, it seems not excessive, but it seems impressive that somebody would go virtually every day. But she just had that fascination.
People did then. I mean, I think what happened was there was no entertainment during the war, so there was an enormous surge in people going out into the cinema. Football matches, we had crowds of 60,000 every week. So people were flooding back. We used to go to Speedway, stock car racing. So all these things started up again.
Was there any sense in either of your parents of an artistic streak or anywhere in the family?
Looking back, there was. I mean, they had no chance to go to art school. My mum came down from South Shields. I was born when she was 20, so she probably came down when she was about 18 and was a nurse, moved towards being a seamstress, and probably now would have gone to college and done the fashion course. And Dad was an electrician, drew beautiful little drawings for us of things he was interested in, like steam trains and boats and things like that. But it's hypothetical. I mean, they now I think they would have gone to art school, but there wasn't the chance to. I mean, I was very lucky because when I went at the age of 14, there were grants. The schools were opening back up. It was a perfect time, really.
And as soon as profiles started to be written of you, they would always say working class artist. When growing up did you become aware of what that meant, of being working class?
I think if one has to, if you contextualise it, I think I'm upper working class, whatever that might be. But my parents worked, I suppose, accounts for that. I mean, I was never, we were never poor, really poor. We were, and we lived in a nice house, so we were upper working class. But later on, you become far more aware. When you meet really upper class posh people, you realise how working class you probably are. So it's relative.
And as you mentioned, you were part of that particular and now declining British generation, the wartime evacuees. Many people who that happened to, they have very vivid memories of it. Do you?
Extraordinarily vivid. When war was declared on a Sunday morning and that speech was on the radio, there was an immediate panic. And one person in our street had an Anderson shelter, so all the children were rushed to the shelter. We looked towards Germany, expecting invading armies instantly, and we were evacuated literally the next day, unofficially. There was someone in Dartford who had come from this little village in Essex. So we were evacuated to a village called Hellions Bumpstead, which is almost a kind of comedy village name. It was next to Steeple Bumpstead, which was a comedy village name. And it was right on the intersection of Essex, Cambridgeshire and Suffolk, incredibly rural and remote. And then what happened was that because we were evacuated, it was a curious system that you still took the examination of where you'd come from. So I took the examination for grammar school all by myself, in fact in Steeple Bumpstead School, and didn't get in.
But it was for Kent.
It was for Kent.
Yeah.
So my brother and sister both got into the grammar schools, which were very good grammar schools in Dartford. I then got into the technical school, and when I went for the interview, they said, the art school is part of the technical school. If you want to go to art school, you can pop round the corner, do a drawing exam, and go to the art school. So it was presented to me at the age of 14, this whole thing of starting at this very definite point. So, I mean, I never had any plans to be an art student, so it started from then.
Another piece of luck is that you didn't specialise too soon in any one art form, that the kind of training you got, which I think would be pretty impossible to have now, you were trained in almost all available art forms.
Yes, I did what was the last year, what was called the intermediate examination, and that had gone back since the mid-19th century, so it was the same teaching I would have got then. And you did life drawing, costume life drawing, silversmithing, woodwork, stone carving, wood engraving, architecture, anatomy, and my chosen craft was Roman lettering, which was very much a discipline. So that was the intermediate, and then, as I say, I did the commercial art course. So but the thing is about that, I only did half the course. So in a way, I'm even now I'm a kind of rogue designer because I don't know what I would have learnt in the second part. So I did typesetting and I did my Roman lettering and I got halfway through the course, but I do things both as a painter and a graphic designer because of my background, that if I was a real painter I wouldn't do, and if I was a real graphic designer I wouldn't do. So luckily I've got this kind of rogue element.
And also, lucky, that very broad training you were given, I mean, that has led to, as you've referred to, the variety of the work you do.
It has, and certainly in printmaking. I mean, but both those disciplines in later life I went back to. I mean, having been taught wood engraving in the early 70s, I thought I'd like to do it again, and I got books, and I vaguely remembered how to hold the engraving tool, but I got books on how to do it. I did some practice blocks, and then I cut a portfolio called Sideshow. And looking back, they're incredibly detailed. I mean, I don't know how I did them.
There's a strong sense in what you've said of being an accidental artist, in effect, that other people making the decisions, say Technical College direct you towards art, and then Royal College of Art steer you towards painting. Was there a point at which ambition kicked in which you started to think, I really want to do this?
I wanted to be a painter. Once I was at art school, I wanted to be a painter anyway, so that's what was so exciting about the change. My teacher said, you'll never make a living, not me particularly, but nobody at that point would make a living being a painter. So you do the commercial art course and you've got that to fall back on. As the graphic designers were going through my work, I'd sent one little oil painting of my sister, and Sir Robin Darwin happened to be sitting in on that selection committee at the Royal College of Art, and said, I think we ought to show this work to the painting selection committee, and it was taken over and they accepted me.
Obviously, counter histories are difficult and sometimes futile, but you must have reflected over the years if you had got into grammar school or whatever. I mean, do you think it would have come out in some way, the art?
Probably. I mean, who knows which direction anyone might go in. I was once asked what I would do if I wasn't a painter, and after deep thought, I went through, maybe I would have worked in wood in some way, and then I decided I would have been a professional wrestler. So who knows, who knows where one might have been gone.
Are there painters who don't like painting?
Well, it's hard work. I mean,
sure
there are whole areas of time.
Hard as well if things don't.
Well, it's a strain. I mean, it's a very nervous. I mean, I haven't done it. I did it. I set this up. Normally at home, I go through a whole ritual of sort of. I dust the table and polish it, and I lay out the paints, and I get everything ready, and I put a record on, and I walk around a bit, and it's like a fighter. You really sort of build up to it.
When you started out, did you have a theory of art? Did you have a kind of manifesto in your head, or was it all just instinct?
I had a good backing of history of art, and by the time I started to paint, I knew pretty much about painting, and I knew I was a figurative painter. I knew that I was interested in the magic realists in New York, Ben Shahn. I had my influences. My fellow painters in the year ahead of me was Frank Arbach and Joe Tilson, so I was also aware of the seriousness of painting. In my year was Leon Kossoff, and then the following year was Richard Smith and Robin Denny. So all around me were all these other kinds of art going on. So I was aware of the abstract expressionists. I think if you are a painter, you automatically go where you're taken almost. I mean, I knew I was a realist painter. I always had this ambition to be an abstract expressionist, and I finally dealt with it many years later and did a picture called Am I Too Late to Be an Abstract Expressionist? and I tried it, I splashed some paint on. So I dealt with it in that way. But I suppose it's like a kind of track almost that you get onto and it leads you through. You almost don't make the decisions, you just find you're on a path.
One of the paths from the 1950s and 60s, but right through your career, is the use of collage. in many famous pieces. Now, it seems to me that was increasingly part of this great stream of competing images, TV and advertising and movies and magazines. And that in a way you wanted to reflect that, the kaleidoscope of images.
I was actually told at a very specific time about collage, and Richard Smith, who I shared the flat with, taught me about Kurt Schwitter's. So I mean, he said he picks up bus tickets, and so for years I always included a bus ticket. I felt that the collage always had to have a bus ticket in it. So, but once it was offered to me as a medium, I embraced it, and I've used it. I mean, I'm still using it to this day. And I think it's not easier than painting, but it's in a way it's using another material, and it's using found art. And I mean, the very early collages were exactly like Schwitter's. That I would find a bit of wood and a bus ticket and maybe a sweet wrapping, and make these little tiny collages. And it's gone on from then, where now I'm making a kind of collage on the computer. I mean, I can't do it, but we've done a whole recent series called The Butterfly Man. It's 6 feet by 5 and designed on the computer, and it's exactly the same technique.
You say that with computers you can't do it, but I mean, you could presumably, but you just don't.
There isn't time for me to get really proficient, and I don't want to just play with it. And I'm a Luddite as well. I mean, I don't wear a watch, I don't have a mobile phone, and there's no way I'll ever work a computer.
In one of those early collages on the balcony, another thing the collages do is that it puts art within popular culture, or vice versa. So you have magazine covers in that, and that was one of the things that was going on in the 60s, and which would be very useful for you, was the rise of the magazine.
Yes, it's interesting that you say it's a collage, because it's a painting. No collage at all.
Painting, yeah.
No collage at all. But that's part of one of the art games I've played with myself. The sort of trick playing of making a collage look like a painting, and sometimes making a painting be like a collage. So it's interesting that I mean, I know it's a painting, but it's interesting that you called it a collage. I mean, what I was doing with that painting, it was a set subject at the Royal College of Art. You were given 2 choices. I recall that the other choice was the story of Lot, so a biblical story, or On the Balcony. So what I did was I found all the On the Balconies I could, and then presented them with the 3 children sitting on a bench, holding up magazine versions.
Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Her Royal Majesty. There she goes, Her Royal Majesty. She's the Queen.
This picture, it's an oil painting, and there are about 27 different versions of On the Balcony in it. When I did this picture, people said, why did you bother to paint them? Why didn't you just stick them on? You just can't win.
So that was the reason for that particular painting. But by then, I mean, in the Air Force, it was part of my week was to go to a little house on the aerodrome and buy picture posts. So right from the beginning, I've loved magazines and still do.
That's the other social subset you belong to, apart from evacuees, is the national service generation. Was that a happy time or just an inconvenience?
It was an inconvenience. I'd already got into the Royal College, so I had this to look forward to. I didn't have an awful time. You would be 30 men in a Nissen hut. There would be nights when there were fights, play fights, beds being turned over, pillows being thrown, and I would blissfully sleep through it, and it would happen all around me. I was incredibly shy until then, pathologically shy, and suddenly to be with 30 men, you can't be shy. There's no way you can be shy. So it was good for that, and I met people I wouldn't have met otherwise.
And you'd come out of the Second World War, and we were moving into the Cold War era. Did you believe, as many people did at that time, that you would end up, your generation, fighting a war?
Well, I was in the Air Force at the time of the Korean War, so it was unlikely that I would have gone, because I was a teleprinter operator, and I think it just overlapped. I was in from 51 to 53, So the possibility was there, and certainly the possibility that there would be a war with Russia was very much in the air. But I didn't ever think I would be fighting in it. I mean, luckily, I was too young to fight in the World War, and I never envisaged that I would actually be a fighting machine.
And you never went to the opposite extreme, as some people did, of being a pacifist or a conscientious objector?
No, I didn't. David, to his credit, David Hockney did, and had horrible jobs in hospitals for his 2 years. And some of the other artists did, and some went to great lengths not to do it. I mean, there was a trick of pretending you were gay. A couple of people shot their toes off, I think. A lot of people pretended they were mad. I kind of didn't bother. I didn't want to shoot a toe off. I just accepted that I would do the national service. I had the Royal College to look forward to, and it was a missing 2 years, but it was okay. I travelled a bit. I went to Belfast. I went to some nice places in the West Country. It was okay.
One of the key early paintings, self-portrait with badges, which I've always liked a great deal, but there are many things going on there. One of them is it's a technically striking idea. You get portraits within a portrait in a sort of almost Magritte way, but what led you to that painting?
I was doing it specifically to send to the John Moores competition in 1961, and I think the idea, in a way, was almost to present myself. It was going back to children with badges. So at that point, an adult wouldn't have worn a collection of badges. They would have worn one badge, if they were, I don't know, if they were in the Women's Institute or something. I think what was interesting about it, which is the point you're making, is that the badges kind of added information. And curiously, it's false information, because I only had those badges. I'd only collected like 20, and one of them, for instance, said, "I'm madly for Adley," and I don't think I even knew who Adley Stevenson was. So some of it is false information, but some said, "I like Elvis," and I was holding an Elvis magazine with Elvis talking to Tuesday Weld. So hints about what I was interested in were coming out. Yeah.
I was going to say the Elvis identification was real.
The Elvis, again, he isn't my favourite rock and roller. I mean, I prefer Chuck Berry and Little Richard and the Everly Brothers. But if you're painting about icons, I think you have to take the chief icon. So if it's a blonde actress, it's got to be Marilyn Monroe. If it's a young French actress, it's got to be Brigitte Bardot.
This is like living in Girls Town.
If it's a rock and roll, it's got to be Elvis. So I accepted that he's the main kind of motif, the main idol. And then I've got a big collection of Elvis material, and I've made quite a lot of art including him. I mean, one of the very early pop art pictures was 2 transfers that you got in Boyfriend magazine of Elvis and Cliff. Well, I was only a Cliff fan for about a day, I think. I saw him at Chiswick Empire. When he was really young, he was brilliant. As soon as he did Living Doll, I stopped being a fan. So,
why such an extreme reaction?
It's a horrible song.
The other striking thing about that self-portrait with badges is you were only 29 at the time, and yet you're entirely recognisable as you are now. Did you paint yourself slightly older, or was that an accurate representation?
Pretty accurate. I think probably, clearly I've changed a lot, but I've more or less got the same hair, and I've more or less got the same beard. It's got longer and shorter, and it's greyer now. But I haven't changed that much.
From very early on, there are paintings that are abandoned or unfinished, or even exhibited unfinished. You've always had a very fluid attitude to what is meant by completing a painting.
Yes, I think I've had this attitude that everything is always in progress. And in a curious way, I very rarely have completed a picture to my intentions. I mean, if I'm doing a portrait, I would paint the eye, and then I would get involved with each eyelash, and then I would get involved in whether there's a piece of dust on the eyelash. So it's infinitesimal. So in a way, I never achieve what I set out and what I see in my mind. So always everything is in progress, and I never abandon anything. So there might be pictures in the studio that by now I know I'll never finish, but they're in progress still. I'll never make the decision. Only that will be decided when I stop.
Although in fact you have made the decision that they won't be finished.
Well, usually they have to go. I mean, either with self-portrait with badges, Robin Denny arrived with the van that was taking them all, and I was still working on it, and they carried it out and tied it onto the roof and drove it to Liverpool. But if you look at the shoes in that, one is painted, the other one is very loosely painted, but there's a little strip of detail, and that was all I had time to do. So I accepted the unfinishedness of it, and I think it's become part of recognising what I do.
Well, a good example to me is the 1962 Beatles, where George Harrison isn't in fact finished, is he? Or at least he's not clear.
None of them are really, and again, it must have been time running out. And I mean, what happened with that painting? In each corner is a little white empty panel, and my intention was to get them to autograph it. And Paul was the first person to see it, and without actually refusing to autograph it, managed to leave the studio without autographing it. And I think he wasn't flattered by the way I'd painted him. And then there was no point in trying to get them after that. So, but it's the same. It's the same phenomena. There are usually areas left unpainted.
And some of the classic dates that are given at the end of a painting, there are astonishingly wide periods in some of yours. For example, a Mad Tea Party at Watts Tower, 1968 to 1992, which is 24 years, isn't it? So, yeah. But during that period, there would be years where you wouldn't go near it, presumably.
Probably, yeah. I mean, the longest time was the portrait of David Hockney in the Spanish interior. And that I started in, I think, 64, and I think I finished that probably, it was about 30 years, yeah. But I wouldn't have been working on it all the time. And again, it's not finished. I could have it back and work on it some more.
I wondered about, in terms of inspiration for painting, can it only happen while you're painting? I mean, you wouldn't, while sitting in a restaurant, think of a detail for a painting?
I might. I keep notebooks. I mean, I always carry a notebook, and I take notes, and if I think of something, I jot it down. But I don't think I've ever had an uncontrollable urge where you leapt from the dinner table and ran back to the studio. I'm sure there are artists who have, but I don't think I've ever actually done that.
So in your notebooks, what kind of thing? You write down words or sketches? Or
yes, little drawings, lists of things. I've become an almost obsessive list maker. So if I think of a series of words or an idea or something I might paint in the future. So it's a memory aid, really.
Apart from the connection with pop art, another thing that comes up in connection with you in search engines always is the Beatles, because of the painting of the Beatles and also Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. A lot of people who hung out with the Beatles suffered the delusion that they were a sort of honorary fifth Beatle, but did you ever have that yourself?
Well, I suppose in a curious way. We're still very close friends with Paul, and went to his son James's birthday party last week. So I mean, only a couple of days ago we were round the piano having a sing-song with Paul McCartney. So I would count myself as a friend, and I talked at length to Olivia Harrison, and I mean, if George were alive, he would be a friend. Ringo and I have never particularly got on, but John, I would say I was a friend of them, yeah.
And John had an quite strong artistic side, didn't he?
He did, absolutely. He was at the art school. I mean, the first time we met, in the early 60s, it couldn't have been long after that particular John Moore competition that we talked about in 61. And I won the junior prize, which was Artist Under 35. And it came up in conversation, the painting. and he said, you shouldn't have won that. Stuart Sutcliffe should have won that. So right from the beginning, he was abrasive. But that was the way he was. I mean, that was part of his personality. And he was a very interesting, nice man.
And that period, the 60s and the Beatles, it's now a fabled historical period. Did it feel like that at the time? Did you think these are extraordinary times?
You were aware that exciting things were happening. It was very much a kind of renaissance, a rebirth, you know. I suppose the other answer to that is that I've never, ever done any drugs. I mean, I've never smoked a joint or had any drugs. So, and that was an integral part of the 60s, really. I mean, I remember an evening with people who were literally on an LSD trip, who came to my studio and said, you've got to take LSD, your life is incomplete. You know, so I've had people kind of begging me to take drugs and not. But so I missed that whole aspect.
But I wondered about that because, as you know, a lot of artists and musicians were tempted because they thought it improved their art, it created psychedelic art or whatever. You were never tempted at all?
I was tempted, but I never accepted. And I think part of that was possibly technical, you know, that with smoking, I'd smoked as a kid, and I stopped when I was 12, so I'd kind of forgotten how to smoke. So when I was passed a joint, I was embarrassed that I'd do it wrong, so I didn't do it, and then by chance the next time I chose not to do it. So it was partly technical.
One of the iconic works, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover, how did that come about?
Beatles had commissioned a cover already, and it had been done by Simon and Marika, who were the Fool, who later painted the front of the Apple shop. So it was a very psychedelic, kind of fairyland cover. Robert Fraser saw it, and Robert was a great friend of both the Beatles and the Stones, and was my art dealer at the gallery I was with at the time, and thought he said, look, in years to come it'll just be another psychedelic cover. Why don't you do a cover with, in italics, you're a fine artist, he said, why don't you use one of my artists, and recommended that I did it. They'd already got the concept of being Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and that was to do with the fact that they felt that they couldn't ever tour as the Beatles again, but maybe they could tour as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. They knew they couldn't, but it was a concept. I think Paul had already had the kind of idea of them being in a park, and my main contribution was to add this kind of magic crowd, that if we did it by making cutouts and eventually using waxworks, they could choose who their fans would be.
And so I then asked them all to give me a list of people. Mm-hmm. I can't remember them all, but so I'll point out the one I can. That was a guru, and that's Alistair Crowley, Mae West, Lenny Bruce, Stockhausen, that was one of John's choices, I think. W.C. Fields.
Who's that?
I think it's, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's Young, probably. I mean, the whole thing has always been wreathed in mystery, this album. Mainly contrived. I mean, we didn't do it. It just, I mean, when there were rumours that Paul was dead and that this was a stand-in, one of the rumours was that because this hand was above his head, this was the sign that he'd died.
Oh,
in fact,
really?
it's Izzy Bond waving to his fans,
It's beautiful.
Did you ever listen to any of the music for it?
I did, yeah. Well, I was in the studio a lot. Most evenings we would go in and hear what they were doing. I mean, I have incredible memories of going in and seeing John in the corner just doing the kind of hellos from one of the songs, or an evening when we went into the foyer of Abbey Road, and there was a great big carpet laid out, and George was sitting around the carpet with about 10 Indian musicians, and he leapt to his feet, and they all leapt to their feet, and we met them, and then we walked through, and they carried on recording George's song, the Indian-inspired song. And one particular night, Paul said, come back to the house and listen to this song, Lovely Rita Mita made. So we heard it the day it was recorded.
And particularly given John's strong views on art, when the artwork was revealed to them, was that a tense moment?
They didn't ever really. I mean, in a way, they've never said thank you. I mean, they didn't respond that much. We were paid £200, and Robert Fraser, who was probably stoned out of his mind anyway, signed a contract and signed away any rights I had. Certainly, I had no royalties, but he also signed away the copyright. So if people write to me for permission to do something, I have to refer them to Beatles management.
Does that make you angry?
It did. I mean, over the years I've been angry, but...
Because you could have made tens of millions.
I mean, if Robert had said, give him a penny for each record, I mean, Paul is a multi-millionaire, and I only once have kind of touched $500,000. So I'm not. I mean, I suppose that is rich to a lot of people, but it's not rich compared to the Beatles. I mean, I could have been very rich.
Do you ever talk about it with Paul?
No. In a way, I think the friendship is more important. In a way, he perhaps should have talked to me, but I wasn't going to go and say, "Look, Paul, why didn't you make up for it and give me some money?" And now I'm resigned to it. So in a way, emotionally, it's gone. It's not a worry.
We talked earlier about the origins of the term pop art, and it was very strongly used in America. I'm interested in your relationship, particularly with Andy Warhol, because there's a certain overlap, particularly in the Marilyn Monroe images. Was he an important figure for you?
He wasn't an influence, no. We never got on. We met about 8 times, and he hardly spoke. And I, believe it or not, then didn't speak that much. I mean, the first time he took me all around the factory and showed me everything that was going on. And the last time he came over and had a show, he painted the British show of dogs, especially for London. And Michael Chow gave a dinner for him at Mr. Chow's, and we were all upstairs at Mr. Chow's at the other end of the room. And at one point, Michael came over and said, "Oh, Andy said he'd love to meet you," as though we'd never met. And I said, "Oh, come on, we've met 8 times. We've never had anything to say. I'm not going to come over." And now I think that was so stupid and churlish, and I wish I'd just gone over and said hello again.
And there's much argument even now over Warhol's reputation with detractors and defenders. Where do you think he ranks artistically?
Oh, I think he's one of the greats. I mean, the great icons are Andy's Warhol, Andy's Elvis, Lichtenstein's early battle pictures, and I don't much like Lichtenstein, but they're the great pop art icons,
Your British near-contemporary David Hockney, there's a conversation going on with him through your work. There are various pieces: Portrait of David Hockney, Souvenir for Hockney, Have a Nice Day, Mr. Hockney. That is an artistic friendship, that one.
It's both an artistic friendship and just a friendship. I've done Desert Island Discs, and I did it with Roy Plumley and then again with Sue Lawley. And the first time, they said, what would you like your luxury item to be? And I said, can it be David Hockney? And they said, well, a David Hockney. I said, no, can I take David Hockney? I said, we're good friends. We could talk about art on the island, and we could draw together, and it'd be fun. And they said, no, you can't take a person. But so that's the level of our friendship.
The Brotherhood of Ruralists, which was the second big movement you were involved with, pop art and a more formal movement. Was that a conscious change of direction after the 60s? I mean, this was the 70s. You wanted to do something different.
It came out of that. My life is very much split into decades, and literally at the end of the 60s, there was it wasn't a direct feeling, weren't the 60s great, let's have a change. But I think people were tired, and a lot of people moved out from London, and it turned into that kind of self-sufficiency mood of the 70s, and we were part of that. I went to see David Inshaw, and through David re-met Graham Arnold, who was at the college at the same time as me, and we were having dinner one night, a group of us, and talking art, and talking about the Pre-Raphaelites, and I think it came up, which Pre-Raphaelite would you have liked to have been? I would have liked to have been John Everett Millais. And in a way, it came out of that talking that we had a meal on each solstice. So in the winter we would have an indoor feast, in the summer we would have a picnic. And finally we actually gave it a name and became a group and had a manifesto. And at that point, art politically, it was very unpopular. I mean, our manifesto was that love was a reason to paint. Sentimentality, I mean, the word sentimentality, which is a filthy word in the art world, was a valid reason to make a painting. So we got a lot of stick from the critics, and we answered back. And I mean, Brian Shaw had a concerted attack on Kitai and Hockney and I for years. He seems to have eased up now, but he would write a review of somebody else and then ended by saying, but they're nowhere near as bad as the Kitai exhibition. I mean, he had a campaign against us, but it was his job to. I mean, he worked for the Standard, and I think if he wasn't nasty, he'd have lost his job, but that's by the by. And it came to a natural end for me when Jan Harworth and I separated in 79, and I came back to London. So by definition, I mean, a ruralist is a city person who moves to the country. So by definition, I'd come back, so I no longer.
I was going to say, the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was quite a dangerous model to take, because
Absolutely.
it had led to terrible sexual complication and fallings out and everything.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, the ruralists didn't quite follow that, but it got complicated, yeah.
A series of works in the 1990s, Exhibition of Rhinoceros in Venice and the Madonna of Venice Beach series, they're doing something that brings a lot of what we talked about together, that they're bringing together the two sides, your knowledge of classical art but also modern art. I mean, they are a blurring of those two things, or a conversation.
I was the third artist in residence at the National Gallery. So the first thing I did was I walked the whole of the National Gallery, and then there was one particular picture called Exhibition of a Rhinoceros in Venice by Longhi. And I'd been doing the Venice Beach pictures, so I suddenly thought, well, I could place it in Venice Beach, California. So that's a good start, so I can go in on the first day and start that picture. So I changed the rhinoceros, but the first element of the crowd are copied directly from Longhi's painting, and they're obviously dressed in 17th century Venetian clothes with masks on. But the next layer of crowd is roller skaters and a bunch of gay men who are kind of laughing at the Venetians. So a whole story evolved of a rhinoceros in Venice, and that was a very good starting point.
And by this stage of your life as an artist, I mean, almost 60 years of work, is the technique pretty much established, or do you come up against things that you can't do?
My actual way of painting, I mean, in some way you learn the business. I mean, the first day you paint, you've got this stick in your hand with hairs on the end, and you've got this surface, and you don't know that red and yellow, if you mix them together, make orange. And you quickly learn the techniques. You're taught the techniques, luckily I was. So you quickly reach a point of skill, and that develops. But with my actual painting style, I think it's developed because I've got older. I've got better, I think. And I'm very much aware now of the unfinishedness of the pictures in the 50s, 60s and 70s. So I do tend to complete them now to a level standard. I never attain the finish I see in my mind, which we've talked about, but they're equally unfinished, if you see what I mean. But I've got better, I think.
Celebrity has been one of your subjects. We live in a culture that's drenched in celebrity now, reality TV, blogging and so on. Are you alarmed by the way we've ended up, modern culture?
Some elements of it. I mean, about 5 years ago I saw 1 minute of the X Factor and was so horrified by this kid being abused by these horrible people, verbally abused. I mean, people who shouldn't be auditioning anyway. So I very much dislike that kind of celebrity. I think footballers are paid too much. I admire their skill, and I'm still a football fan, but I think that element of celebrity probably isn't good for them. So there's a whole element of what I don't know quite how to put, vulgar celebrity that I don't like. But I adore someone like Kate Moss, who is a celebrity and a character, and so I suppose I choose my celebrities. There should be your level of fame you achieve either through achievement or looks or whatever it might be, or having a good voice, and the level's gone all wrong. People are famous who shouldn't be.
The modern art market has become commercially huge, astonishing sums to most people being paid for works of art. Do you ever feel uncomfortable about that?
I've never been involved with it. I've always happily gone along in a kind of middle area where I've never been. Well, I have been broke, but I've always done quite well, and I've never done very well. It's only really in the last 2 years that I've become financially secure, mainly through printmaking. There's an area where I can make a print and it sells and I make some money from it, and that's very nice. The paintings they're just beginning to. A few have sold for a lot of money, so maybe I'm about to touch that area, but I've never been. It's never been a problem earning too much.
In general, with other artists, are you competitive with other artists?
It is a competition, yes. You think you're better than some people and less good. You're not as good as others. But not now. I announced my retirement at the age of 65, a conceptual retirement. And it wasn't a retirement from work, but it was a retirement from avarice, and jealousy was one of those things. So I'm now not jealous of other artists. So to answer your question directly, in that manifesto, I stopped being competitive and jealous and all those art world things. But professionally, you're always competing. And in the show Homage 10 by 5, I've chosen 10 artists and I'm making 5 pieces in homage to each of them. And one of them is Rauschenberg. So in a way, that's about competition and respect and homage.
And when you say you've conceptually retired from such things as jealousy, I mean, in reality, psychologically, when so-and-so gets amazing reviews or reputation or sells for $40 million...
I'm thrilled. No, I mean, it really, something worked. I mean, a transformation happened. And I can't think of anyone I'm jealous of at the moment.
And in that list of 10, Damien Hirst is in there.
Yeah.
Which would surprise some people. Kingsley Amis famously said in literature that one generation had to despise the generation that came after them, that the old had to despise the young. But the YBAs, which some of your generation, I mean, do hate. I mean, quite openly hate. You don't.
It's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting question because I absolutely don't hate. I mean, I think I made a point of being their friend. I mean, I didn't need to be their friend, and they didn't need me as a friend. But I went in the other direction to despising them, and a lot of them still are my friends. And I felt it. I've tried to describe it as a kind of a duty almost. When I was a young artist, I remember when Francis Bacon, who was a friend but was a bitchy old queen who yelled at me or something. So you remember all this stuff, and I decided I didn't want to not like them, and probably went the other way and kind of befriended them and supported them. Not that they needed it, but
did they want it though? I mean, young British artists such as Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin and so on, were they properly respectful towards you?
Oh yeah, I think so. Damien went to Leeds to art school, and in Leeds they have my picture called Window, which is a deep box that hangs on the wall. It has a wax head and curtains and pictures behind the curtains. So to look into it, you've got to become a voyeur, and you've got to get very close, and you're suddenly very aware of this wax head as a real head. So he'd seen that and admitted to being influenced by it. So yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know what they say behind my back. I'm sure some of them say silly old fart or he's stupid or whatever. But no, I think this respect, yeah.
And having announced your conceptual retirement at the age of 65, do you contemplate ever actual retirement, or will you just keep going?
I'll keep going. I mean, since then, at the age of 75, I announced that I was into my late period. So, I mean, the idea of that is that I don't want someone when I've gone deciding that my late period started whenever, So it started already, and I did have an idea to sign everything and make a stencil saying your late period picture number 1. I haven't actually done that. But again, it's a kind of a realignment of my attitude to things. And in a way, in your late period, you can go completely barmy. I mean, Picasso did all those extraordinary late erotic pieces. So I've given myself another excuse to be naughty and to do what I want to do, and I'm enjoying that.
Do you have any specific plans as to how you're going to go barmy like Picasso in your late period?
I've done it, yeah. I mean, I'm there. Certain things have happened already.
Which are the barmy ones?
It's hard to be specific. I think it's a mood rather than a particular.
But it's a total freedom, just
total freedom. Yeah, both mentally and psychologically and aesthetically, it's complete freedom from whatever the pressures were before. I mean, a freedom from critics, from finance. I mean, luckily I'm now financially secure, so it's a freedom from that in a way, and it doesn't matter what the critics say anymore. It's not going to affect me anymore. Whereas when you're young, when you've done 5 pictures and someone comes along and kicks the shit out of one of them, it is hurtful. Now it doesn't matter.
How much do you care about posterity as to what critics will say in the future as to which paintings will hang in which galleries?
I'd like to be remembered, but again, I mean, that little phrase sets me off on another path. I mean, which paintings in which galleries? My relationship with the Tates. I mean, I've never ever had a picture in Tate Modern, unless they haven't told me. And there was a time about a year ago, we went to Tate Britain, and there were 5 shows on that I could have been in. There was a British pop art in the 60s that I wasn't in. There was a show of figurative painting that I could have been in. They'd done that first show of drawings from the collection, which I easily could have been in. I literally could have been in every category, and I wasn't represented. So my relationship with that particular part of the art world isn't comfortable. I resent not being represented better. Does that answer your question, or is that a mad
No, it absolutely does.
tirade?
No, that absolutely answers it. Sir Peter Blake, thank you.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.